Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest Work Foundation event. Today, exploring our recent research produced in partnership with the Chartered Management Institute, looking at the importance of managers and the role that they can play within insecure work settings. My name is Ben Harrison. I'm director here at the Work Foundation. We're a policy think tank that's part of Lancaster University. We're committed to supporting everybody to access well-paid, secure employment, and our current work programme is particularly focused on job insecurity for those who face structural disadvantage within the labour market, as well as the interrelationship between health and work. And those are clearly going to be two issues that we're going to explore today in the course of the conversation. Over the course of the last 3 years, we've produced a range of research aimed at particularly understanding more about insecure work in the 21st century. Our UK Insecure Work Index provided a new measure of insecurity, taking into account not just things like 0 hours contracts, but also levels of pay and access to key employment rights. And the 2024 edition of that index will be published in the coming weeks, so please do look out for that. Alongside that work, we've also been able to dig down further to understand the kind of worker groups who are most at risk of experiencing job insecurity. They tend to be those groups who face wider structural disadvantage in the labour market. So women, those from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds, those with disabilities, and young people in particular. And as well as that, we've also been digging down into some of those sectors like retail and hospitality where insecure work is often concentrated. And we've been able to add to the evidence regarding the impacts that this insecure work often has on people, including in terms of financial well-being and mental health. So given all of that context, our aim in coming together with the Chartered Management Institute in partnership for this project and this event today was really to explore how within those sectors and organisations where more insecure work occurs, how can senior leaders and managers seek to address those issues, both in terms of addressing the kind of root cause of that insecurity, in terms of how work is organised and roles are designed, but also where there is insecure work prevailing within organisations, how can managers mitigate the worst impacts of that when they themselves may very well also be facing insecurity in the job that they do. So those are the kinds of issues that we want to explore today, and we'll be looking in more detail at the research itself, which we recently published, as I say, in partnership with the Chartered Management Institute. So firstly, we're going to hear from Asli Atay, the lead researcher on this project from the Work Foundation. She's going to give us a summary of the findings, and then I'm also delighted to be joined by an expert panel who can then offer their reflections too. So we have Anthony Painter, who's Director of Policy and External Affairs at CMI, Tracy Gilbert, the Scottish Regional Secretary at USDO, and Chris Smallwood, Director at Britannia Anchor Removals. Before I hand over to Asli, just to say that we are recording the session today, and if you do want to ask a question during the session, please do use the Q&A function, and I'll do my best to make sure we get through some of those. Once we've heard from each of our panelists, we'll be opening it out into a more broad discussion, and I'll try and bring some of those questions in. For now, though, that's enough for me. I'll hand over to Asli to take you through the research findings.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining us today. So my name is Asli, and I'm a policy advisor at the Work Foundation. So as Ben was summarizing, and some of you might already know, we've been working on job insecurity, the scale of job insecurity in the UK to understand its scale, but at the same time, ways to tackle it for the past 3 years. And our research shows that nearly 1 in 5 jobs in our labor market can be categorized as severely insecure jobs. And while we consider job insecurity as a nationwide issue, we also see that certain sectors are more likely to use these types of contracts, like temporary contracts or 0-hour contracts. And these are sectors like social care, hospitality, and services. And as our colleague Rebecca Florison's recent research showed, that some of the impact of job insecurity can be quite concentrated in certain local areas than the others as well. So this is one of the reasons why we are interested in this issue, the scale of job insecurity and how to tackle it. But there is another reason why we are interested in this. That's because we know that people who are structurally disadvantaged in the labor market are also more likely to be employed in these types of contracts and sometimes find themselves involuntarily working in these types of contracts as well. And these are young workers, women, ethnic minority workers, and disabled workers. Over the past 3 years, we did some deep dives into the topic and explored the impact of job insecurity on these particular groups as well. And we were particularly interested in working in partnership with CMI on this research because this research is about daily experience of insecure work and the role of managers, the role good management can play in tackling some of the adverse impacts of job insecurity and supporting people to have better work conditions. So in this project, I worked with my colleagues, Rebecca Florenson and George Williams, and it was based on a mixed method research. So we did two big surveys, one with over 3,000 workers in insecure types of jobs, as well as a survey with over 1,000 line managers who manage people in these terms and conditions. In addition to these surveys, we also conducted qualitative research and spoke with workers, as well as conducted focus groups with line managers. And on top of that, we also had several conversations with experts to test our policy findings. So we had lots of interesting findings, and you can find them in our reports, both policy report and as well as employer facing report. But I guess I can summarize our findings in a way that people who are employed in these types of contracts, insecure work, often experience lack of autonomy, lack of predictability, and also face long-term financial strain. So what we found was that we found approximately 1/3 of workers expect that they will lose their jobs in the next 12 months, which obviously means lots of uncertainty about their life. And we also see that close to 60% of insecure workers want more predictable hours. And when we were talking with workers interviewing them, this came a lot in our conversation, and they talked about like how it is quite difficult for them to plan their weeks and months and also make financial plans around their work conditions. And similar to that, we also found that over 1/3 of workers said at least one of their shifts was cancelled in the last month without proper notice or in advance notice. So in addition to this, like another thing that came up in our conversations as well as in our research findings is the financial difficulty that comes with being in these kind of uncertain, unpredictable, precarious jobs. Almost half of the workers we surveyed said they cannot pay an unexpected bill of £300 within the next week. And in addition to that, people talk to us about the difficulty in getting loans or applying for mortgages because they cannot really predict future. And evidence also shows us that when job insecurity becomes chronic or involuntary, it can have long-term impacts on people's career progression as well as over health and finances too. In addition to that, we see both from our conversations and as well as literature review is that managers actually can play a role. And when we speak with managers, they are also very much aware of it, most of them. So managers we spoke to mentioned that they try to adapt their managerial style when they work with people who are on temporary contracts or zero-hour contracts. So they try to give them more clarity or try to be more understanding, give them more flexibility when they need to accommodate their health conditions, caring responsibilities. This is particularly important because we know that when people are happy at work, satisfied at work, they are more productive and as well as they are more likely to stay in that job. So it helps with retention. And to test it, we run a regression analysis to see how being treated well impacts people's satisfaction with their job as a proxy measure for productivity as well as retention. And we actually see that workers who report being treated well by their manager are 7.5 times more likely to be satisfied with their job. We try to explain that business case based on these findings in our employer facing report as well, but we thought it was quite interesting to see that in the data analysis too. But this is not the whole picture. So we also see that managers themselves face limitations and challenges when, even if they want to be helpful or improve work conditions, mainly because of two reasons. One is that job insecurity is often impacts people, or a whole sector, as well as that employer, which means that managers themselves are not immune to job insecurity. And when we surveyed managers, half of managers also expressed a desire for more predictable hours, or they also talked about like not knowing enough to plan in advance in their roles as well. So there is that sectoral impact, but as well as managers also don't have that autonomy or sometimes like influence over their decisions, which is also limiting the ability to help their employees. And we also see that 8% of managers also expect to lose their jobs in the next 12 months. So in order to, I wanted to bring two example case studies from our research. So Diana is a young woman who lives in southwest of England and works on 0-hour contract. Diana said she really needs flexibility in her job, mainly because she's a single mother who takes care of a disabled kid with complex needs. And that's why she is currently working as a receptionist on a job shared arrangement on a zero-hour contract. But one of the things Diana kept mentioning us a lot was that she finds her experience of flexibility quite one-sided, and she talked about like how at certain points she was asked to do things out of her job description, but she couldn't say no to her manager, mainly because she didn't feel that she had that power to be able to say no, as well as she mentioned us like how her shifts were quite unpredictable. One week she was working more, the other week she was working less, which made it quite difficult for her to arrange her caring responsibilities. Whereas when we talked with Calvin, who had a great manager who was super supportive of him and his career development, he had a completely different experience in this case. He was also a part-time worker on a temporary contract, but despite he was on a temporary contract, his manager helped him to get training, and which meant that he was able to progress in his career and also get a promotion. So in line with all these findings, we had a set of recommendations to both national government, local authorities, and employers. We have a long list of recommendations, but I wanted to choose a couple of them because we really think legislation is key in many ways. So we wanted to start our recommendations with uh, strengthening labor markets, strengthening labor rights, because we think flexibility should be a day one right, and workers should be able to request predictable working patterns. Even though we haven't had the employment bill, which was promised a while ago, it's great to see there are some private bills in the parliament which are moving in the right direction. In addition to that, we ask for a wider array of metrics for large employers to be able to measure the scale of job insecurity in their organization. We already do similar kind of exercises for other measures, but I think we also want to be able to say the same for job insecurity. We also had a set of recommendations around developing management capability in organizations and the government's role in supporting especially small size employers who may lack in-house resources. And similar to that, because job insecurity often concentrate in certain local areas, we also want to see local authorities embed these management practices in their regional programs and skills programs, and also use procurement as a way to incentivize good work. And lastly, in line with these recommendations, we had a set of advice for line managers as well as senior management, because we think some things needs to come from top, like monitoring and evaluating the scale of job insecurity, or giving more standardized approach to shifts or working hours, which can then be taken by managers to implement these with communication with all staff, not just permanent staff. And we would like to see enhanced workforce engagement, which also should include unions and as well as staff surveys. And we also want to see investment in line management training, because we know there is lots of evidence which shows it can be quite successful. So I will stop here, but I'm looking forward to discussion on our key findings.
Thank you, Asli. That was really helpful. Great to get a summary of the research. Anthony, if I can bring you in now from the CMI. I mean, clearly, as we've just heard from Asli there, the research itself very, very rich, but paints a very clear picture, I think, about the importance of managers within organisations where insecure work exists and the kinds of weight that their decisions can have on the wider fortunes of the workforce. So it would be great to get your perspective from CMI, what your members report and the organisations that you see are doing.
Brilliant, thank you, Ben, and thank you to Asli and team for an excellent piece of research and set of policy recommendations. So I'm just going to be brief. I mean, there are three things that I think we know, and I think these three things raise a big question, and then there is a question of how we respond to that question and where we come out to the discussion. So the three things we know what workers want and need. We know that management is important, and we know where the challenges are in terms of the sectors of the economy, but also where some of the opportunities might lie to lean in to better support insecure workers. And the big question is a policy question. So on the first one, we know that workers, particularly those in insecure work, they want more job security. They have a very strong desire to feel more supported by their manager or supervisor, and they're very likely to want more flexibility in terms of how they balance their private lives, their care and responsibilities with their work. And we did a large-scale survey at the end of last year, which shows that those in insecure positions, and we did this by education level as a proxy, so it's not perfect, but it's a good rough measure. Shows that group of people are far more likely to say that feeling supported by their manager and supervisor is important to them than those potentially in less insecure work. So there's a desire to see a difference. We know that good management, going to the second point, makes a difference. In the same survey, we did a split looking at the experience of those with an effective manager versus those with an ineffective manager. And suffice to say, those with an effective manager were far more likely to feel valued and appreciated, almost by the same order of magnitude as Asli and team's research found. They're more likely to feel motivated to do a good job, to be satisfied, to find their work meaningful, to recommend their organisation, to think their organisation has a good culture, and to be happy with their compensation and benefits. So that's a difference between having an effective and an ineffective manager. It makes a huge difference. And by the way, the differences were huge, sort of 50 percentage points in some in some of those questions. So we know that management makes a difference. We know the sectors of the economy that we're talking about. And we know that there might be opportunities as well, where you see a large prevalence of insecure work and high levels of company growth and performance and potential to grow further. There might be more attention to actually leaning in to support the workforce so they can retain the workforce, develop the workforce, and so on, given that an organisation could be on a growth trajectory. In the public sector, there's opportunities there in, say, the care sector in particular, where we know there's a prevalence of insecure work, and the public sector and government policy has some influence on it. So those are three things we know. It raises for me a big question, and the big question is, should policy go further than just setting the framework in which people are employed? So beyond minimum wages, beyond improved workers' rights, and all this is important, and enforcement of those things is important as well. And obviously, for example, the Labour Party wants to go further with its New Deal for working people. But the big question is, should we take policy into new territory, into companies, into organisations, to try and use policy levers to promote better quality management through supporting uplifting training development, giving a greater priority to management capability in, say, public service procurement, in major government strategies, which takes us into a different territory beyond the rules of the game into how the game is played at an organisational level. And the answer for me is yes. I think we should go further and faster, because for the benefit of workers, it would benefit companies and employers, and it would benefit the economy and public services more widely. And maybe we can come back to some of that in the conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Anthony, and we certainly will. But before we do, I'm now going to invite Tracy Gilbert from USDO to come in as well and to reflect on the findings from Asli, but also anything that you've heard there from Anthony, Tracy, that particularly resonates as well.
Thanks, Ben. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here to discuss this important research from the Work Foundation on an issue that affects so many workers across the UK. I represent workers in retail, distribution and food manufacturing workplaces, and workplaces are too often characterised by low pay, short hour contracts and constant restructuring. This research from the Work Foundation certainly chimes with experiences in the research carried out by USDO. Our cost of living surveys have constantly found that workers feel worse off, that they're struggling to pay monthly bills, and that many are facing mounting debt. For many years, USDO has been calling for action to tackle insecure work. One of the key routes to achieving this is that the right to a contract that reflects the normal hours that people work, because we know that too many people are on short hour contracts and they often end up working extra hours on a regular basis, but they're not reflected in their contract. They're required to provide maximum flexibility to be available whenever the employer needs them, but the flexibility is only one way and is not often returned. Also, this has a wider impact on people's ability to exercise their rights at work. As you know, if you need to keep on the right side of your manager to get the hours you need to pay your bills, then it makes it much harder to stand up for yourself when you're being treated poorly. And that's even if you have a manager at all. Very often now rotas are set by algorithms, and management structures in retail, as in many other sectors that we've already heard, have been completely hollowed out. So if there's little human contact when important decisions are being made, but workers around shift patterns, we know that that doesn't make people feel great about their jobs. And cutting out layers of management might save employers cash in the short term, but it's a false economy. Good managers can make a real difference, and I welcome the recommendations to support them and with the right training, including through apprenticeships. But let's be honest, even the best managers can't fix a broken employment model. We need an urgent action from governments to give workers the security they deserve. So I'm pleased that the Work Foundation recommends new employment laws to strengthen job security. From USDO, we would say that this must include the right to normal hour contracts, a genuine living wage, sick pay from day one, because some people aren't even entitled to statutory sick pay depending on the hours they work, stronger redundancy rights and trade union rights to ensure that everyone at their work has a strong voice. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tracy. And finally, then I'm going to bring in Chris Smallwood. And Chris, it would be great to get your reflections generally on the journey that Britannia anchor removals have been on with regards to these issues. And I suppose particularly perhaps picking up on some of the challenges there that Tracy's just put forward around the kinds of behaviours that she's looking not just for legislation around, but also for employers more broadly to be adopting.
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree with an awful lot of what's been said, and thanks to Asli and her team for a great report. It's very in depth, and I think it's very reflective of the situation at the moment. As a small business, we embarked on a journey 8 years ago to become living wage, living hours accredited. We became members of the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter in 2022, later becoming their Employer of the Year last year. And we've embarked on a journey that involved engagement with our staff, a culture of openness about what the company needed to survive and what the staff needed to feel valued by the company. So we worked very hard on those areas. And I think the report handles an awful lot of the issues that were brought up to us as a business, and we introduced these changes to make sure that our staff now are on full time. To be honest with you, living hours was a no-brainer for us. We're a living hours employer, which means our staff get paid a minimum 16 hours a week, and they know their shift patterns 4 weeks in advance. But I have to stress that all of these things were brought in with the agreement of the staff. We've never been anything other than minimum hours anyway. I find 0 hours and anathema, and I'm not sure how you can get engagement with your staff not paying them anything from 1 week to the next. But nevertheless, and bearing in mind 63% of small businesses, that small businesses employ 63% of the workforce in the UK, the big question is, can it work, and will it work if you start introducing these changes? And the answer is yes, because we're living proof of it. But not only does it work, it's actually made us more productive and more efficient. Our absentee rates have dropped dramatically since we became living wage, living hours, and also since we became members of the Good Employment Charter, which covers things like equality, diversity, and inclusivity. But I would also add that we do pay sick pay from day one as well. And one of the great concerns from people that I speak to is, how do you afford it? Well, actually, if you deal with the underlying issues of how you treat your staff, then absenteeism drops. And if absenteeism drops, if you're paying them from day one, the cost becomes very manageable. So there's so much I could get my teeth into in terms of this report. I do think procurement is important. I think procurement and tender opportunities for businesses like mine needs to be made more accessible by making it a prerequisite of being good employer charter membership, for example. I do think enforcement's absolutely crucial. I agree 100% with Anthony on that. And I think there should be tax incentives for businesses like ours as well. That instead of taking our profit away from us through tax, allow us to reinvest it within the business with our good employment practices. I would say there are some outside forces, and I know there's lots of business out there say, can it work? Will it work? And I know we're living evidence that it does work, but there are outside forces that need to be controlled as well, such as the impacts of Brexit, the monopolistic nature of Google, and finally, the behaviour of landlords when it comes to rent increases at the end of any rental period or lease period. I think these are all things that need to be considered as well. But all in all, it's a very deliverable report.
Thank you very much, Chris. If I can invite everybody now to turn your cameras back on, we'll go into a bit of a wider conversation. And Chris, I think where you've sort of left us there is a perfect jumping off point, because I think a lot of the kind of discourse you hear about some of these issues is the idea that there's somehow a trade-off between organisations being productive and profitable versus providing fair contracts and job security for their workers. And your story and your experience is that these things don't need to be mutually exclusive. And I just wonder, Anthony, whether that resonates with some of the work that you've done at CMI and some of the kind of feedback you get from organisations as well.
Yes, and quite apart from the underlying principles of supporting workers and the package of benefits that Chris described, what I found was really interesting from both Tracy and Chris is this notion of engagement and worker voice as part of the process. And when you feel involved, you feel that sense of commitment, but also it's more than that as well. The organisation can pick things up. It can pick things up where it's deliberately hampering people. It can adapt its practices and policies and procedures as a result. And I think any healthy working culture will have that degree of engagement. And I think high quality managers, and again, I'm struck by what Tracy was saying about this hollowing out effect, because if you don't have those feedback loops in the organization, you miss a lot of critical information. So I think what's striking about the anchor removals case is, the openness that's in and around the whole process of this. And when you've got that openness and you've got that engagement, you can develop organizationally to enable you, one, to support your people, but to be a better competitor within the marketplace. The wider rules and regulations matter as well, and everybody has to play on a level playing field at some point, absolutely. But you can give yourself a head start if there is that level playing field with the sort of practices that have been discussed so far in the conversation.
Can I just add on to that, Anthony? I think the engagement and openness creates a culture of trust as well, and trust is a really big thing in a business. One of the greatest challenges for me employing in an industry that I've worked in for 34 years, man and boy, and I started at the bottom. So my company operates on the basis of what I learned from my appalling experiences that are reflected in the report. And so you have to, first of all, build trust with your employees, because remember, they've been dealing with a culture of really poor employment for the time leading up to them joining you as a business. So the more open and honest you can be with them, the more they will trust you. And of course, you've then got to trust them, that if they are ill, they're ill, and demonstrate that trust by not punishing them for that illness. Hence the sick pay from day one. And yeah, so trust is a really important thing. Level playing field is another important phrase you used as well there for all businesses, because businesses like us can often be punished for doing the right thing. And that's why I'm big on enforcement, because if other businesses are forced to behave properly, and we're not asking them to do anything special, we're just asking them to abide by the laws and regulations that are out there at the moment in the UK. If they're being forced to behave in a proper way, that gives us a sporting chance.
Absolutely, and we know that that needs to be a big priority for the next Parliament, whether we see a new employment bill or not, because enforcement around existing labour regulations has been poorly resourced for some time. Tracy, I want to bring you in here as well, and it sort of speaks to the conversation we've just been having there around transparency and trust and openness. You mentioned, I think, something really interesting, which is also sort of featured in the report, about the power dynamics that often exist within insecure work settings. And I also want to bring in, and re-emphasize the point that Asli was making around the fact that a lot of this ends up compounding structural inequalities in the labour market. And so if you don't have that openness and trust and transparency between management and workforce, then even if you're intending to do a good thing, you might be inadvertently reinforcing some of those structural inequalities. And so it would be great to get your reflections on that in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was listening to Anthony and Chris there, I mean, one of the things I think that's really critical is to change the relationship, how employers view trade unions, because we are there as a critical friend. We're not there, we're problem fixers, not problem causers from the trade union movement. And I think the more we can do around building that understanding and relationship, the more equity there will be within that partnership between employee and employer. There is obviously an imbalance of power, because whoever your employer is, whether it be one person or an SME or a multinational, you are employed by someone, so that there's an imbalance in that relationship from beginning to end. Although contractually you should be on equal foot, and the reality is very different to that. So I think we really need to rebalance that understanding of what the role of the trade union is within that organisation, and to enable people to have a voice. Now, good employers will obviously enable that to happen. And some of the problem is accessing workers whose employers do not really want employees to have that effective voice. And that is the crux of the problem. So whilst any member, any working person can be in a trade union, the reality is employers often put up hurdles and barriers to prevent that from happening. And I think one of the main things that certainly Asli do, working in partnership with employers, is have conversations about what those relationships look like. And within retail and the sector that I represent in the main, but this is also true in the public sector where I've also represented, when people feel empowered, they're likely to do a better job for you. Chris was saying that earlier about his relationship with his employees and about goodwill. And goodwill goes a long way with people, but they also want that mutual respect to be given back. And if you look at retail as a sector, we are, one, it's a meritocracy, so you can join the business as a trolley person or on a checkout, and you can become the manager of that store. And if you look at a department in a big retailer, for example, those people have amazing skills in terms of they could run their own business. They're real self-employed skills. They're managing their own department or whatever they're doing. They're all entrepreneurial skills, but they're not deemed to have that value. And if you don't value workers, and retail's a good example of this again, and I'll finish on this, the fact that we represent mainly women, low paid, young, disabled, black workers. It's a very mix across retail. But in the main, these workers are not valued, and that is why we have the underrepresented groups working in them. If people were given the credit for the work that they do, not only in a financial way, but in a meaningful way, it can be added value, not just about living wage, but around flexibility, around sick pay from day one, around contracted hours being built in, around flexibility around care, as well as flexibility around work. This makes people loyal, and people want to stay in these jobs because it's a relationship that works for both them, their families, and their employees. And I think there's a wider societal issue that we need to address if we're going to work together to resolve this dynamic going forward.
Yeah. That's really helpful. Thank you, Tracy. I'm going to bring in some questions that we've had from people watching the webinar today. And Asli and Anthony, I'll probably come to you first, if that's okay. So we've had one around investment in line manager training and around emotional intelligence and sort of falling into a training trap. And I'll come to you on that one, Anthony. But there is a sort of subpart to that question, Asli, which is around the extent which managers themselves can feel insecure in their role, and in a sense end up being caught between looking to support people, but also themselves facing insecurity. And I just wondered whether you could say a little bit about how that came through in the research.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really important point, and that's why we always go back to that point around legislation, because there are certain things like managers will be able to do. And I guess the main story of our finding is that lots of things that you need to do around insecure work arrangements is about being a good manager. In a sense, like if you're a good manager, you will be more able to help those in insecure contexts as well. But there will be challenges that we saw in the conversations we had in the survey we did with managers. And the reason is because the sector is insecure in total, or the organization doesn't have those standard procedures to protect the workers, which at the end managers are also employees of that organization as well. So I think the first solution to that is to have those right standards in place, whether it is about predictability, providing people predictable hours, or flexibility with their work, or sick leave, as we all talked about, so that managers can feel empowered to make the right decisions and support their employees, staff around those rights. And everything we talked about today, like even though we are talking about job insecurity from the lens of job insecurity, we know that the things we talked about today, sick leave, autonomy at work, influence over decisions, flexibility, these are all relevant to the bigger questions around the labor market about retention issues or the rise in economic inactivity driven by ill health. So if we have these principles in place, it would help workers, but as well as it will help managers to be more empowered to make the right decisions and have those influence in place.
Fantastic. Thank you, Asli. And so coming to you, Anthony, we've actually had a couple of questions about this. So yes, investment in line manager training, but I guess getting under the skin of what that training might look like, and also, I guess, the need to ensure that managers have the proper resources in place in order to manage.
Yeah. You might find me out my most strident in answer to this question, Ben, so apologies in advance. But it's kind of astonishing how much of our time and energy is, and we're a chartered professional body for management and leadership. We don't represent managers. We don't actually provide management training. We do qualifications and accreditation. We exist to safeguard the quality of management and leadership and improve it over time. But you won't believe how much of our time is spent arguing that management is a skill that you can define, that you can be something you can learn, that you have to learn, in fact. And in fact, 82% of people who become managers have had no training in management at all. Now, there's very other few sort of levels of responsibility that you require on any level of sort of trade or skill or technical capability, where such a small number would have had any management training at all. So what does it involve? Well, we have a set of professional standards. Other people who create qualifications in this area, whether it's universities or other providers of technical qualifications, will have a set of standards. Ours has inclusivity at its heart, sustainability, ethics at its heart, and then it's about sort of self-management, managing your own emotions. It's about collaborating and working with others and developing others. Then, of course, the organizational things, setting KPIs and designing processes. So those are general skills that go across all industries, but it matters in context, of course. You've got to have knowledge of tech or retail or care, very deep knowledge in order to be an effective manager in those areas. So it's about applying those specific skills in those areas. What should management training look like? There are some great government-backed schemes. Management apprenticeships are excellent. If you can get on one, levels 3, 5, 6, and 7, Help to Grow is good. But anything that's accredited and formal and contextualized, I would say, that is based on some recognized standards that are shown to have an impact over time. So management apprenticeships, they deliver a return on investment that's 3 times the initial outlay over 9 or 10 years. Same in our case with the Chartered Manager Reward. Help to Grow, which is a Department for Business and Trade scheme, has been shown to have some good outcomes as well. So anything that's proved its outcomes is based on standards, that is formal, contextualized, and high quality. Those are the things that are worth investing in.
Fantastic, Anthony. That's such a super and helpful answer there. And we've got another question from Tom Hadley, who I think rightly points out in a way that lots of people on permanent and full-time contracts obviously face the risk of job loss as well. There's a kind of general set of economic headwinds that the country continues to face as we head into 2024. And he raises the issue around skills and employability. I think that is right. Those are 2 really important factors in terms of people being resilient to some of those changes that we may see in the labour market and the economy more broadly. I think where we would approach those sorts of questions from an insecurity perspective is by looking at the sectors, the roles, really crucially the worker groups who are more likely to be in more precarious forms of employment. You actually see the people who are most at risk in that regard. And we know from research that these kinds of roles and remaining in insecurity for long periods of time can actually have a negative impact on your ability to go and get the skills you need and the employability experience. So I think it's a really good point, but I think these things are ultimately linked. Chris, I wanted to bring you in now, if it's all right, and to kind of maybe reflect on some of the things we just heard from Anthony there around the support that managers can benefit from. I was particularly interested, I suppose, as well to understand whether, as you've introduced some of these changes into your organisation, was there any resistance to any aspects of them, or have you found managers finding particular elements difficult? As you've gone through that journey, have there been bumps in the road that you've had to navigate and that you could perhaps share with people listening in to sort of help them on their journey?
Well, and just a couple of things. Anthony absolutely nailed on with the management training. Actually, what set me on the pathway to where I am was I took a Goldman Sachs 10,000 small business growth course, which was absolutely crucial in the not just the advancement of my business, but actually in my personal advancement and my understanding of why I was there and what I was doing. It's always the why with a business owner. Why am I running this business? What is my purpose? What am I aiming to achieve? In answer to your question, was there resistance? No, not really, not from the staff, because I come back to something that your questioner just mentioned there about people in full-time jobs aren't secure, and he's absolutely right, and I was nodding along in the background. But if you've got a culture of openness, if you're honest about what your business position is and how you're managing that position, that those individuals will feel that little bit more secure because you're being open with them. I was brought up in a culture of mushroom management, and I won't give you the definition of that description, but I think you all know what it means. And basically, that led to that 30% statistic that you've got, Asli, that says you expect to lose your job in the next 12 months. I spent my entire life for the 18 years as an employee thinking this could be my last day of work. That actually creates a mentality in you that you carry into your management and then beyond, actually into your business ownership. For 4 years of business ownership, I had in my mind this could be my last month of trading. That's crazy, but that was the kind of mentality you'd been dealing with. So when you start to be open and honest with people, you get that trust factor. So I'm in a very fortunate position in my company. If I said to my staff, jump off the warehouse roof, they'd probably not ask me why and just get on with it. But that's because, you know, you create that culture within your business where if you're asking them to do something, they think there's a good reason, it's in their best interest to do it. But of course, you're going to ask them to do things that you can then support with why you're asking them to do it. And I think that's really, really important. And if you explain the longer position, because sometimes you're making short-term decisions that have long-term benefits and they don't see why you're doing what you're doing. But the one thing I would say to anybody listening is, if your first reaction, and I was just thinking about outside forces as well, and I hinted at it earlier about the monopolistic nature of Google and landlords tripling rent on companies and things like that. We just experienced that, and I sat down with my staff and explained to them precisely where we were at in the negotiating position with our existing landlord. And one of the things I said to them is, the one thing I won't touch is your wages. Okay, the one thing I can guarantee is we won't cut your hours. Okay, we might, if things go really badly, have to have a discussion about redundancy, but that's not on the agenda at the moment. And if you're having those kind of open discussions, that builds a tremendous trust base with your staff, and they know exactly what direction you're taking.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you, Chris. Tracy, we've had another question, and Chris, you may want to come in on this afterwards as well, which is particularly around the risk that we hear quite a bit, actually, that for an individual business to invest in training of their managers, in a sense, they would be facing that risk that those individuals would go and get another job somewhere else. And so they're investing money and they won't actually see the return on it. And presumably in an area like retail where turnover can be quite high, you might face some of those perspectives in your engagement with employers as well.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I was reading the questions in the chat just there. Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is an employee who's invested in is less likely to leave a business. And I think if that bears out in most statistics, of course, there's always risk involved in that. But I think having that pipeline, I guess it's harder if there's only you and one other person and you're really relying on that person to stick around. But I think in general, if you're investing in having those conversations around and then being valued within that relationship, if they see that they're getting that they're being brought on and investments coming not only in terms of financial hourly rates or salaries, but around pensions and other ways that you can add into that package, people are more likely to stay than not. I think there's a huge issue around skills gap, and I think that it's something that, I mean, we're behind, I think, in many ways in terms of skills gaps for the economy that we've got for now and for the economy for the future in terms of where we need to deliver training. And I hate this phrase, but it's used a lot, so I'll use it in the context of I hate it. People being economically inactive and about how we grow the economy and business. And actually, I'd be keen to dive into that economically inactive and see what that looks like, because I think for most people who are economically inactive, it's probably because they are doing an unpaid role elsewhere, either we're caring for parents or caring for grandchildren or caring for some other gap in the employment market that doesn't exist, or there aren't enough people employed in that role for them to do. And I think the added value of adding on to people's skills and giving them opportunities and giving them creative roles within their job, giving them that trust to expand that role in a way that is helpful to the business and also helpful to themselves, while supporting them with skills and training. And again, the trade unions are very good, because we have learning workers and projects that we can involve to strengthen employees' skills and abilities within the workplace. All those kind of investments will pay dividends in the main. There's never a perfect science to it, but the more that you invest in individuals, the more they're likely to invest in you.
Yeah. Anthony, I noticed you came off slightly. Yeah, there you go. You've raised your hand. Over to you.
Yeah, so just very, very brief. Isn't it interesting how we always ask the question, what if I train someone and they left, but we never ask the question, what if I hire someone that hasn't been trained? And, you know, you've got to look at both sides of the equation. There is a firm that does, and that's Travis Perkins, that actually has set up an apprenticeship system, known full well that a portion of those apprentices will leave to competitors. But their argument is we'd rather have people in the industry that are trained that we can hire later and down the road, and they'll have a great experience with us, and we want them to come back. They will. They've even started training some of their competitors' apprentices for that very reason. It's incredibly enlightened. And another brief point to make on this, I think this is where there could be some tax incentives involved. Chris, quite a way in the conversation, mentioned tax incentives. I think if you use your apprenticeship levy to train someone up and they leave, you should be able to claim some or all of that back. And I think there probably is a role for some sort of tax credit if you've invested in training and that person doesn't stay with you for the entirety of the value of that investment. So I think we should look at measures in the tax system to readdress the balance and open up that more enlightened set of questions.
Thanks, Anthony. And Claire Toogood makes a very good point. That also, what if we don't train them and they stay, which is a good point. Chris, I don't know if you want to come in any. I saw you nodding along as
I just did. Yeah, I just did. And again, I agree with Anthony. One of the things that I think sits at the heart of many a failing business is that word fear. Where they fear the consequence of what they do. If I'd have allowed fear to control my direction of my business, I wouldn't be here now. We wouldn't be having this discussion. And actually training, the evidence is and I give personal experience on this. In 1993, I was put through my first ever training course in my industry. I'd only been working in it 4 years at the time. And actually, I didn't leave my business. It actually made me feel, and I think Tracy said the word valued. I felt like they had a value for me, that they had something bigger in place for me. And I think that is something you should. It's very difficult sometimes as a business owner to put yourself in the shoes of your worker. But in my experience, when you train somebody, they really appreciate it, and it adds that value. And bear in mind, we train up heavy goods drivers in our business. We're in the process of training 2 up now. Trust me, they're in demand at the moment. And we've, touch wood, I've never had one leave me yet. Not after I've trained them. In fact, we've got one on a pathway now to management. So, you're actually creating that pathway of progression.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time, folks, and we've probably got time enough for kind of one more set of issues. And particularly where I wanted to go with this final bit of the conversation was just to explore the kind of interface between introducing more flexibility for workers within insecure work settings. So the ability to kind of have more discretion over the shifts that they work or autonomy within their role, but also kind of balancing that with predictability around shift patterns, and whether we saw that as a kind of particularly difficult area to get right between employee and employer. And Asli, maybe you can kind of come in at this point to just give a little bit more of a sense of what we heard through the research, and then I'll try and bring others in if we've still got time.
Yeah, definitely quite interesting question, and in a way a problem to solve as well, because we know flexibility is something workers value a lot, and that's why most of them take these jobs in insecure contracts. But at the same time, I sometimes feel like we kind of trap ourselves in this question because we think predictability and flexibility as things that are mutually exclusive, but obviously they can be also part of the same picture as well. So flexibility should come with predictability. Otherwise, it will only harm people's mental health, as we see from our research, or as well as physical health as too. Because when we don't know when we will be working or for how long, from where, it just puts lots of pressure on workers. And what predictability should always be part of the picture of flexibility, and this can be done through the things we already discussed about, like having standards in place about working hours, paying people decent pay, giving them sick leave, also involving them into conversations. Because when you engage with workers, the ones who, like, obviously all businesses will have different obstacles or different challenges when it comes to their working arrangements. But as much as businesses, workers are aware of those challenges as well. The people who do the jobs, they know where there can be more flexibility or where there will be no room for increasing flexibility. So if you bring them into conversation, if organizations have effective ways of engaging with their workers, they would be able to see that they are actually very much aware of the limitations, but they would be able to say, this is the way predictability can be embedded into the flexibility you offer. And I think it's quite key in our recommendations as well, to engaging with workers, as well as having those standards in place so that that flexibility is two-way and benefits both the organizations as well as individuals.
Fantastic. Tracy, I'll briefly bring you in if that's all right, 'cause you've come off silent.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I've just to add to that, I mean, I think that our most recent survey has showed that 1 in 5 employees don't have any sort of rhyme or reason and pattern to their working schedule, which obviously doesn't just impact on them, but if that's part of a family or a household, then that brings instability and insecurity to the other person in that role as well. So I think that flexibility, people do want flexibility because of all the demands that are on people's lives, but it has to work both ways, and there has to be security enshrined in that, or it doesn't work for anyone, and that is when people fall out the job market.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tracy. So I'm now going to kind of bring us to our final question to kind of try and round the conversation out in the final couple of minutes that we've gotten. And I'm aware that each of you are kind of coming at these issues from slightly distinct backgrounds. So I'm not going to be too prescriptive about that. But given we're still in January, the beginning of a new year, I guess my final question is, how do we actually start making some big, tangible progress on the kinds of issues that we're talking about here today in 2024? We know it's an election year, so there are going to be big policy conversations to be had, but we also know that quite a lot of the power and the decision-making that we really need to kind of see change exists within organizations already, and there are big things that employers themselves can do. So if each of you could, within about 45 seconds, a minute, tell me your one big area where you think we can make big progress this year, that would be great. And Anthony, I'll come to you first.
Well, we'll be asking the next government, whatever flavour it is, to put management capability literally in everything it does. But more specifically, I think, given the question I posed around how do we get behind the curtain of organisations, I think there might be a role for sort of good work missions, if you like, maybe focus on a sector like the care sector, to really concentrate on how rights, responsibilities, resources, capability, management capability, of course, skills can uplift worker well-being, productivity, patient experience over a period of time. The care sector feels like a logical place to start, but really focus in on an area and see the difference that these approaches can make, and then spread them elsewhere.
Fantastic, thank you, Anthony. That's great. Tracy, I'll come to you next.
Well, I would hope with a different flavour in government, we would obviously have the New Deal for workers, which would make a massive change to workers' lives across the UK. But even if we didn't, I mean, the recommendations in the Taylor Review have been supported, so implementing those would be a very good starting point. I think the one thing that, from a trade union perspective and from a worker's perspective, I think access to a trade union would make a huge difference. I mean, it's already enshrined in law, and for employers to maybe embrace that a little bit more would help a lot of the problems that we have, and recognising, as I said earlier, trade unions as problem solvers, not problem makers.
Fantastic, thanks, Tracy. And Chris, I'll come to you next.
Well, this might surprise you, Tracy, but I actually agree with you. And actually, I think that the government could use the unions as the police officers of enforcement, because enforcement's crucial. I would like to see, and this is a personal thing, the banning of 0-hour contracts, and there's good noises coming from the Labour Party at the moment on that front. That is something that I think would be a game changer. We've got to stop 0-hour contracts. There is a place for it, but the number of people that need it is very small and unique.
We might have some research coming on that quite soon, Chris. That might help with that. But I won't go into that just yet. Asli, I'll come to you finally.
Yeah, I guess I echoed what our panelists were saying. I think good work should be at the heart of the policy agenda for the election year and beyond, and we should discuss what it looks like in practice, and as well as see working together, cooperation between the government and businesses should be more radical in their approach and be brave.
Fantastic, thank you, Asli. And I think that just about brings us to time. I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists. this afternoon for their contributions, in particular to Anthony and the team at the CMI for being such fantastic partners and bringing their expertise and experience to bear on this work, and to Asli and the team at the Work Foundation for producing the analysis. We've got a busy programme of research and events coming up in 2024. In the coming months, we're going to be publishing the next UK Insecure Work Index. As I just mentioned to Chris, we do have new analysis coming up on how the UK can go about curbing the use of 0 hours contracts in the next Parliament, as well as work looking at the role of local government in promoting good work, and new analysis exploring the relationship between job quality and health outcomes. You can also already sign up to our next event, which is a pre-budget event scheduled for the 28th of February, where we'll be hearing amongst others, Newsnight's Ben Chew and Lord Gavin Barwell. So it promises to be a really great event. You can find out all about that on our website. But for now, thank you once again for attending. I hope you found it valuable, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.